Hey guys, it's Dr. J here again with another live session. We are going to be looking today at some Java programming, and in particular, we're looking at repetition. The idea here is for us to understand how repetition works in Java. So we first started off with sequential programs. And in terms of sequential programs, I'm referring to writing programs where we had written statements one after the other. And every statement started from the beginning and it executed in a sequence, one after the other. After sequence, we then looked at selection. With selection, we had statements where we had a condition that was either true or false. And based on whether it was true, we did one set of instructions. And if it was false, we did another set of instructions. So that was based on selection. Today, we are now looking at repetition. We're going to look at how repetition is carried out in Java. Now, there are three types of repetition that we can get. We can get a for loop, we can get a while loop, and we can get a do-while loop. So we will go through each of these to get a better understanding how each one works. So in order to do some in order for me to explain these concepts, let's first go into the for loop. Let's start with the for loop. Okay. So with the for loop, the first thing you need to take note of is that this is fixed repetition. Okay, remember that everything we're doing is focused on repetition. So with the for loop, it's fixed repetition. We know how many times the loop is going to execute. So that's a for loop. When we set up the for loop, we have a counter variable. We have this counter variable that automatically sets up when we write the for loop. So we've got this counter variable, and this variable will start at a particular point. So it has a starting point. It has a starting point, and it has an end point. Okay? And in between, we have this condition that we are constantly testing. So we have this condition that we test. And as long as the condition is true in the for loop, then the loop executes. Right? So this is what the for loop is all about. It's fixed repetition. It has a counter. It starts at a certain point and it ends at some other point. So just to get a better understanding of how we set up the for loop, so here we use the reserved word for. We have a round bracket. Then comes our variable. So we say int I, and we give it a starting point. That's what I was saying. So I is my variable. That's my counter variable that I spoke about. And we give it a starting point. That starting point could be any value. Okay, the int here means this variable is an integer. It's not the only data type that you can have, but I'm looking at the simplest case where this variable is of type integer. And I'm going to start the loop at 1. Let's start the loop off at 1, right? And then the second part, so we separate it with a semicolon. The second part is our condition, where I say I is less than or equal to 5. So that's the second part. And then the third part is how we want this variable to change. How do we want it to increment? So here I'm just going to say I plus plus. So what does each part mean, right? But before we go into what it means, we have a starting curly bracket and we have a closing curly bracket. And everything inside of these brackets will be repeated. It'll be repeated. Okay, so whatever statements we put inside of the brackets, that's where the repetition is going to take place. So let's get a better understanding. So I represents our counter variable that I spoke about. So keep in mind that with a for loop, you always have a variable, right? The for loop it comes with a variable. This is our starting point. We spoke about the starting point. And the end point is when this condition becomes false. So as long as the condition is true, the repetition takes place. Okay? So here I'm saying I is less than equal to 5. So it starts at 1. I starts at 1. Is 1 less than equal to 5? As long as 1 is less, which is true, it means, let's put a statement in here. Let's say system out print line, and I'm going to just simply say hello. So that's my single statement that's inside of the for loop. So while the condition is true, it's going to come and print hello. It reaches the bracket and it's going to go back up to the for loop. And when it goes back up to the for loop, it now goes to this part, which is my increment. This is my increment. I plus plus means we are incrementing or we're changing by 1. That is the same as saying, another way of writing it is I equals I plus 1. So that's our increment. We are changing by 1 each time. So when we go back up, remember I had the value 1, that was the starting value. From 1 it goes to the increment, and I plus plus from 1 it becomes 2, and it goes into the loop and it'll print hello again. It goes back to the top to the increment, and what I omitted in the previous repetition, when it increments, so I was 2, it becomes 3. You always test the condition. So when I is 3 less than equal to 5? As long as it's true, we repeat. Remember, we stop when it is false, but we repeat when the condition is true. So when I is 3, we repeat and we're going to print hello. We're going to go back up and increment from 3, it's going to become 4. Test my condition is 4 less than equal to 5. That's true. And then it comes in and it prints hello yet again. It goes back up. So that's where the repetition takes place. It goes to the increment. It becomes 5. Is 5 less than or equal to 5? True. The condition is still true. As long as it's true, you come into the loop and you execute, and it's going to print hello. It still goes one more time, it goes back up, and I increments from 5, it becomes 6. Test the condition. At that stage, is 6 less than or equal to 5? And that's false. So when the condition becomes false, that is when the loop will stop. My loop now stops. The danger is if you don't set your condition properly, you could go into an infinite loop. It can just continue, constantly be true, and then you're in an infinite loop. Or if you don't set it correctly, it may not come into the loop at all. So you have to make sure you set your condition properly when you are writing the for loop. So this is essentially how we set a for loop. let's get into our Java compiler, and let's just write. Let me take this out, and let's just write a simple for loop. So I'm going to type for the first part, I equals 1. Sorry, I equals 1. There's my semicolon. The second part, I less than equal to 5. And then the third part is my increment, I plus plus. Okay, just a word of caution. Do not put a semicolon there. That will create problems. Because a semicolon means you're ending the line. Now these semicolons here mean you're ending those sections. Now if you put a semicolon here, it means your for loop, you are ending your for loop, right? Which is wrong. We don't want to end the for loop. So we start the for loop, system.out.println, or let's go print line, and I wanted to print hello, and I need semicolons there. Okay, so here is my for loop, and this is the statement that's inside of my for loop. Okay, and let's give this a run, and let's see what output we get. So immediately I'm getting some type of an error. Error cannot find symbol. So it's a little confused about this I variable. That's why we need the int. The int means we are declaring the I value to be an integer. This is the easy way. If you want, you can say int I, declare I outside of the loop, and if I run it, that will also work. Okay, and you will notice it prints hello 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. But from a coding perspective, I think every time you write a for loop, my suggestion would be declare the variable as you use it. So put in your int at that point. Okay, now I could start the loop at 3. Int I equals 3, I give that a run, and now you will see it's going to print hello 3 times. Because it starts at 3, it goes to 4, it goes to 5, the condition will be true, and then when it goes to 6, it's going to fail. So it's printing hello 3 times. What do you think if I run the loop from 5 and I is less than equal to 5, right? So in that case, the loop will execute just once, because when I is 5, the condition is true the first time round, and it's going to print hello. And then I becomes 6, and it will fail. What happens when I go 6? Okay, now I'm starting I at 6, and when the condition is going to be tested, is 6 less than equal to 5? No, it's not less than. 6 is greater. So it's going to fail immediately. So if I run this, you'll see that nothing is printed. Nothing is printed. What that means is that the for loop did not execute. The for loop did not execute. Some students may think that this is a syntax error. A syntax error. Right? It's not a syntax error because my program ran. You will remember from one of the lessons when we discussed the different types of errors, a syntax error, our program does not run. When I didn't declare the variable, that was a syntax error. Okay, so here this could possibly be this could be categorized as a logic error. This is a logic error. It's not that it's a syntax error. I could even start the loop at 0. Okay, I could start the loop at 0, and then it's going to print hello 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Okay, and you can play around with it. I could take out the equal to sign. I equals 0, I less than 5, I plus plus. I run it, and now my loop is going to run 5 times. Because the condition is only true when I is strictly less than 5. Okay, the point I'm trying to make here is that when you are setting up your loop, if you know you need the loop to execute 5 times, you could run the loop starting at 1, and then you could go less than equal to 5, and that loop will execute 5 times. Or you could start the loop at 0 and say strictly less than, and that will also run the loop 5 times. Right? So either way, as long as you want the loop to run 5 times, that would work. Let's put in here the value of I. Let's print the loop counter. Okay, so I is my loop counter, so I'm just simply printing whatever value I takes on. And now when I give that a run, you will see it's saying hello 0, because that's at that point I had the value 0, I had the value 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, 0 to 4, that means 5 times. And similarly, if I ran the value from 1 less than equal to 5, it's going to run 5 times, but the I value is just different. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so it's just a counter. It's just a counter, and you can give that counter different values. You could also give the counter negative values. I'm not going to go into that. Okay, but the counter determines how the loop is going to behave. Your condition, your starting point, your condition, and your increment will determine how the loop behaves. Remember I++, I said it's the same as saying I equals I plus 1. It's the same as that. So if I run it, you'll see it still works. Right? It still works. If you want the loop to increment by 2, so now the loop is going to change by 2 every time. It's incrementing by 2, not by 1. So if I give this a run, you will now see the first value of I was 1, the next value of I was 3, and the last value of I was 5. That's because of the way I've set my increment. And the way you set it is going to determine how many times the loop executes. But we usually want our loops to increment by 1, so we say I plus plus. Okay. So that's with the for loop, right? That's how the for loop behaves. It has a counter, and that's the advantage. When it has a counter, that's definitely an advantage. And you'll see just now how it helps us when we are working as compared to when we're working with the while loop. So a typical example that you could get, remember, if you look at the examples that we were doing, we said input the cost of 2 items, find the total amount that the person needed to pay. So here, let's now create a question where we say input the cost of 5 items purchased. Right? Input the cost of 5 items purchased. This would mean I now need my loop to run 5 times. Okay, I want the loop to run 5 times. I'm going to need to set up my scanner. Okay, so we usually set up our scanner. kb equals new scanner system.in. Okay, and because of the scanner, we always need to import java.util. That's our package, and I'm importing all the classes. And then because I'm inputting, so now I'm going to put a message to tell the user to enter the cost of the item that we've purchased. Okay, enter the cost of the item that we've purchased, and then there's the cost that I'm inputting from the keyboard, KB dot next. Next what? Next double, because it's a money amount. When something is a money amount, we should keep it double, right? We spoke about double and float. Both allow you to input a point in it, right? But the difference between a double, it allows you to input larger numbers compared to float, which allows you to input smaller numbers. It has a range. The range differs. So I've input my the cost of the one item. I'm inputting that. And remember that this is going to execute 5 times. It's going to be repeated 5 times. Now, the first time round I input a cost, it's going to be stored in this variable. The second time, when the loop executes the second time, remember a variable can only store one value. So the previous value gets lost and the new value is now stored. So because I'm using a single variable, each time the loop executes, it loses its previous value and it gets the new value. So what I would need to do in this instance is I need to sum up, because that's what I want to input the cost of 5 items purchased, and I want to find the sum of the items. That was my intention, to find the sum of the items. So now I need to create an accumulator, sum equals sum plus the cost. Okay, but whenever you create an accumulator like this, you have to give it a starting value, and we're giving it a starting value before the for loop. Okay, before the for loop, I'm going to say let's declare the variable, right, sum, and give it a starting value of 0. So remember, I don't give it a starting value inside the loop. Otherwise it will reset to 0 every time it's going to loop. Here's my accumulator. So every time I input a cost, that cost is going to be added up. It's constantly adding up the costs. And at the end, I'm going to say system.out.println the amount to pay, because I'm adding up everything, the amount to pay, and I'm going to print the sum. This variable is going to tell me how much I would need to pay after that loop executed 5 times. Okay, let's give this a run. Let's see what happens. There's an issue here. Incompatible types, possible loss conversion from double to int. Okay, double to int. Now, I'm hoping some of you may have picked this up. Here, we made the cost double. So the variable cost is double. Now, I am accumulating the cost. So if you're accumulating something that's double, this variable must be declared of type double. So that's what it's complaining about there. This needs to be of type double. Okay, now if I give that a run, you'll see that works. So it's going to ask me, the first time round, it's going to ask me to enter the cost of an item. So let's put down 10. And what would have happened at that stage is that this variable sum would have accumulated this 10 that I entered. Okay, so now when I enter a second value of 20, the loop would have executed the second time, and at this stage my sum should be 20 plus 10, which is 30. Okay, the third time round, let's go 5. The loop would have gone a third time around. Remember, I is constantly changing, right? And the condition is true, and this is accumulating. So now my total sum is 35. It's going to go one more time. That's the 4th time. I'm just going to make this a little bigger. and the final time I'll go 15, and when I press enter it stops. So 1, 2, here we can see it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's because my loop executed 5 times, and this statement is not inside the loop. It then prints the total 60. So if I add up all these values, I get 60. I know I get 60, so that is correct. Okay, so where you place your statements, let's say I'm going to make a deliberate mistake and let's put the output inside of the loop. That means this statement is now going to loop each time, and it's going to tell me the amount to pay. So watch this. Watch how this is different. So when I enter the first value, you will notice at that stage now it's printing that system out print line. It's printing that statement, and it's saying the amount to pay is 10. Now I enter 20. So now it's saying the amount to pay is 30. So that's my accumulator that's doing that, right? Then I enter 50. The amount to pay is 80. I enter 5. The amount to pay is 85. I enter 15. And then the amount to pay is 100. So this is creating what you could call a running total, right? If the question wants you to print at each stage, you could do that. But if the question wants you to print only at the end, then you need to have it outside the loop. So this is now going to print the final answer. It's printing the final answer. So read your question very carefully and then determine where you want your output statement to be. Just one more thing. If I take the accumulator out from there, this, I see this many times. Students make a mistake and you go and put your sum set to 0 inside the loop. So what is the effect? What is the effect? Well, every time the loop executes and I input a value and I accumulate the value, when it goes back up, that sum value gets reset to 0. So it's no longer accumulating if you're going to do that. Okay? And just to prove that to you, I'll give that a quick run. It's complaining about sum, the amount to pay, and then sum. Right, now here, that's interesting. That's interesting. In a couple of the previous lessons, I did explain this concept. Right? I did explain the concept, and I'm hoping some of you may have picked this up. By moving sum equal to 0 inside the for loop, it means the variable is declared inside of these brackets. Now, whenever you declare a variable in between two brackets, it only exists in those brackets. So outside the bracket, now this variable sum, that's what it's complaining about. It cannot find sum. It understands this variable sum here because it's declared in the brackets, but the sum out here, it does not understand. Okay? And then to fix something like that, you increase the scope. So you will say double sum. So what I've now done is I've declared sum at a higher level. So this variable sum now exists between those brackets. So now when I use sum here, it shouldn't give me an error. It shouldn't give me an error. Right? It may complain that I need to set sum to 0. Let's see. Variable sum might not have been initialized. Yes, I thought as much. It's complaining that we need to set it to 0. So I'll set it to 0 there, but I'll still set it to 0 here as well, just so that you can see now. Okay, you'll notice now there's no problems. But if I enter my 5 values, right, 30, 40, and my last value will be 5. Notice the amount to pay is whatever was there last. And the reason is this sum is constantly setting the accumulator to 0 every time the loop executes. So I just wanted to show you, you know what, that's not a good thing. Don't set your accumulator to 0 inside of the loop. So that's just a basic understanding of how to use a for loop. Maybe before I move on to the while loop, what I'd like to show you is that you can have a decreasing for loop. So with a decreasing for loop, you then start, okay, with the higher value, 5. You're now going to say something like this: I greater than equal to 1, and then I minus minus. Okay. Now, what does each part mean? So this was an increment. Increment means increasing for loop, right? This was an increasing for loop. This is a decreasing. That's a decreasing for loop. So the minute you have minus minus, you should know it's decreasing. Therefore, the starting value must be the higher value. Your condition, generally, the sign should be a greater than sign, and this should be the smaller value. Okay. When you look at the increment, okay, we started with the smaller value. Our sign is usually a less than sign, and we have the higher value. So those are just some very simple rules that you can put into place if you're having an increasing loop or if you are having a decreasing loop, which is a minus minus. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that was the for loop, right? That was the for loop. Let's now look at, I'm just going to move this aside, not totally aside, so we can do a comparison. Let's just put a line here. And now I'm going to start with my while loop. Okay. Now the while loop, the first point I want to make is that this is conditional. Okay. Keep in mind, with the for loop, we said it was fixed. We knew how many times the loop would execute. With a while loop, it's conditional. We don't know how many times the loop will execute, right? We don't know the number of times the loop will execute. Okay, I could give you a possible example, and the example I could give you here is if you are baking a cake, and if you are mixing your ingredients together, right? You're baking a cake and you're mixing your ingredients. So you've got a bowl. In the bowl, you've got all your dry ingredients like your flour and your butter, and then you've got your wet ingredients like your milk, and you've got them all in here together with the sugar, and you are now mixing it. Now you need to mix it until a certain point when you need to stop, when this consistency of the batter. The batter is what is inside of this bowl. And once that consistency is correct, I cannot tell you stir 10 times and your consistency will be right. Or nobody can tell you stir 15 times, right? And your consistency will be where it's supposed to be. So here, this is conditional. You keep stirring, you continue to stir until you've got the correct consistency you're supposed to have. Okay, I guess if you know how to bake a cake, then you will know what that correct consistency is. The example I was trying to give you here is we don't know how many times to stir before we get that correct consistency. So everything depends. It all depends on a condition, right? And this condition is the same as the if statement. Remember, when we discussed the if statement, we spoke about a condition, and those conditions are either true or false. So it's the same thing here. If your condition is true or false. Okay. Now, with a while loop, unlike a for loop where we had a counter, there's no counter with a while loop, right? So how do we set up a while loop? So we would say something like this: a while, and then in brackets we would have our condition. Okay, we spoke at length in terms of what a condition is in a previous lesson. If you didn't catch that lesson and you don't understand conditions, you may want to go back and review that lesson. So you're going to say, while a certain condition, while that condition is true, then you are going to execute whatever statements you have in the while loop. That's how it works. Everything depends on that condition, and that condition must be true, then you loop. When that condition becomes false, then you stop. Very similar to the for loop. When that condition here in the for loop was false, remember we said loop stops. So it's the same concept we have over here. Now, there's a rule I want you to take note of when you're working with the while loop, and this is an important rule. And if you always keep this in mind when you're working with the while loop, then you know you will set up your while loop correctly. Okay? And the rule I want you to remember is called I, T, and C. So whenever you're working with a while loop, just remember this: I, T, and C. So always start with the T. We'll come back to the I and the C, right? So the T means test. T means test. And you're testing your condition. You're testing your condition. So make sure when you're setting up the while loop, you have a condition that you are testing. Now the I means initialize. So if you're working with a condition, make sure you initialize whatever variable you are testing. Remember that in your condition you're testing some variable. If I look at the for loop, our variable was I. I was testing the variable I. So whatever variable you're testing in the while loop, make sure you initialize that variable. And then C means change. So whatever variable you are testing, make sure you change it. So you must have these three things in place: initialize, test, and change. Always first identify what you're testing, check to see that you've initialized it, and check to see that you've changed it. And if you have those three things in place, your while loop will work properly. Let's get into our compiler, Online GDB, and let's do a few examples to show you how the while loop works. Okay, so this is what I was using for the for loop. I'm just going to modify this and I'm going to try to first simulate the example. Remember with the for loop, right? With the for loop, we printed hello 5 times. Okay, let's quickly put this in. Int I equals 1, right? I less than equal to 5, and then our increment was I plus plus. And to print, that loop will execute 5 times, and then we said system.out.println, and we said hello, and that will print hello 5 times. Just to confirm I don't have any errors. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that works. Now, how can I achieve the same thing using a? So I'm now going to use a while loop. Okay. Whoops. A while loop. Right. So remember, we need to say while. We need to put in our condition, and there's the setup. So this is the setup for the while loop, and I now need a condition. I want this condition, I need this while loop to do the same as the for loop. So I need something to help me to execute 5 times. Now, this is why the for loop is so nice. It has this variable built in. Now, the while loop does not have a variable built in, which means we have to now build a counter. So I'm going to say count. I could call it anything. I could even use I as my variable, but I'm going to say, well, count is less than or equal to 5. So that's my condition. Remember ITC, right? That's my condition, my test. So count is my variable. Now I need to initialize count, I. So I'm going to say int count equals 1. So count has been initialized, and then I test it. Inside my loop, I'm saying system out println. Let's not print hello, because we know the for loop is, the hello is coming from the for loop. So let's print by, right? So I'm printing by. That's not supposed to open. I'm printing by. Okay. Now with the while loop, remember we said that we test. That's the T. I is to initialize, and then I also need to change. So I need to change count. So count needs to increment. So we need to say count equals count plus 1. Okay. So if I look at this very carefully, remember what I said, ITC. Okay, that's my test. Always know what you are testing first. Okay, in this case, count is what I'm testing. I'm testing count to see if count is less than or equal to 5. Okay, so if you're testing count, make sure you initialize count. So count must be initialized. Okay, so here I'm initializing it and I'm setting it to 1. Initialize means give it a value. Give it a value. So I'm setting count to 1. And then C is my change. So make sure the value of count is changing. I'm adding 1 to my count. Okay. Now if I had to draw an analogy with the for loop. So this is the same as the first part. The test, let me change my color so this becomes, so this is the test, which is the same as that part. And then the change is the same as that part in the loop. So those components of the for loop are also in the while loop, right? But they just set out very differently, because the for loop does not, the while loop does not have a counter. So we are creating our own counter so it can count however many times we want it to do. Because this question wanted me to print the word by 5 times. So it needed some counter to do that. Okay, and we ensuring that ITC is set up, initialize, test, and change. So if I give this a run, I'm expecting the for loop to print hello 5 times, and I'm expecting the while loop to print by 5 times. Let's see what happens here. I give it a run, and if I look carefully, that's coming from the for loop. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's coming from the while loop. Okay, so there's my loop where I'm testing some condition. If you want to test it, make sure you give it a value. So if you leave out the I, and you're testing count, and you don't initialize count, then that's going to be a problem. You've got nothing to test. So you must initialize so that when I'm testing, I've got a value that I can test. If you leave out the change, be careful. You've initialized, you are testing. Remember, count is 1. I test it, is 1 less than or equal to 5. That's true. It'll print by. But when it goes back up and it tests, it's still, count is still 1. The condition is going to be true, so it's going to print by. It's going to go back up. Count is still 1 and it's true, and it's going to print by. So if you leave out the change, this is going to be an infinite loop. Infinite loop means it's going to continue executing and it's not going to stop. Okay, let's give that a try and let's see how that shows up. You can see it's just printing by. You're wondering, where's hello? Well, hello is on the top. If it's not even allowing me, to go to the top because it's stuck in an infinite loop. It's printing by, right? The program is just printing by. So I'm trying to scroll to the top and it's not allowing me. So the program is still running. You'll notice if you look at my controls, the program is still running. It didn't stop. It's gone into an infinite loop. So I'm going to stop the program there. The program is now stopped. Okay. And the reason that happened is because I did not change my variable. Count equals count plus 1. Change it. So that when it goes back to the top, it's going with a new value that it's testing. It's testing a new value. The value is not remaining fixed like it was earlier on, and it was staying at 1. Now it's changing each time. And as it's changing, at some point, the condition will become false. Okay. Another word of caution, if you set your loop, even if you have the change, I've got the change now. I'm putting in the change, right? So I'm saying count equals count minus 1. But my change is incorrect. I'm decreasing count by 1. So it starts at 1. It's going to go to 0. it's going to go to -1, it's going to go to -2, it's going to go to -3, and it's going to continue. It's going to continue. And each time you test your condition, all of these numbers are going to be less than 5. And your condition is always going to be true. Even though I've got ITC, my condition is set incorrectly, and it's going to go into an infinite loop. So if I give this a run again, we're going to get a similar situation. Notice my program it's still running, right? Although you can't see it here, I've got to stop it, but it's gone into an infinite loop. But if I set my condition properly, and it's increasing, and eventually it's going to get to 6, now when I run it, you'll see there, hello, and then it stopped there. The program finished, unlike what happened earlier. So just to recap, right? To recap, the while loop, it's a conditional loop. It's a conditional loop, right? It's based on a condition. It does not have any counter. So if you need something to count, like a for loop, then you have to create a counter. You create a counter the way we did with the variable count. Now, if anybody is wondering, why did I use the variable count, right? I could call it I. If you call it's a variable, call it anything you want to. It's just a name. Okay, so I could have given it the name J. I could just say J, and then here I would say J is less than equal to 5, and then J equals J plus 1. Now that is serving exactly the same purpose as count. I initialized, well, let's go with the test. I'm testing J, I've initialized the J, and I'm incrementing, I'm changing J. And if I run that, my output will still remain the same. So the variable is just, it could be anything. Right? The variable could be anything. Notice I did not use I because I'm using I in the for loop. So I don't want to create any conflict, and I is already declared here. So I chose not to use the variable I. Okay. Now let's now look at, and I think I've already got the solution. So let's look at this solution. Remember with the for loop, just keep, we did this now. We did this with the for loop. We input 5 items, but when I wrote it, I think I started the loop at 1 and I went less than equal to 5. So we did input 5 items, right? There it is here. And we accumulated the 5 items. We added up the 5 items. Okay? So each time we get an item, we were adding it up. And then we output the total. Now, how can a question be asked in a similar way for a while loop? So this is how a question will be asked with a while loop, right? So the question will say something like this. Input an unknown number, input an unknown number of items purchased from a store. So the first keyword, if you want to call it, the first giveaway is when you're working with an unknown number of items, right? If you're working with an unknown number of items, it cannot be a for loop. A for loop wants a starting point and an end point. It has to be a while loop. So input an unknown number of items purchased from a store. And when you do something like that, right? Let me just go to the whiteboard. Right, let me write it down here. Okay, we are inputting an unknown number. Where is my pen? The pen just disappeared. Okay, got it. Right. So we want to input an unknown number of items purchased from a store. Now, as I indicated, the first keyword is we're inputting an unknown number of items. So that's one giveaway that we need to use a while loop. The second giveaway is when they say terminated with a 0. So they give you some value to terminate with. You know, it doesn't have to always be with 0. It could be anything, -1. It could be terminated with a 999. So, but the point I'm making is that how do you know you are working with the while loop? Firstly, it's an unknown number of numbers, and I've got a terminator. I've got something to terminate with. Okay, so this immediately would suggest that I've got to input an unknown number of numbers, and they're telling me when to terminate with a 0. So that cannot be a for loop. So that I will use a while loop. So that would require me to use a while loop. Now at this stage, some could be getting a little confused, right? Some could be getting a bit confused because you could be thinking, but just now, let's go into, I think it was here, we set up a counter, right? This counter, what I was trying to show you is how the while loop works, and I replicated how the while loop can behave like a for loop. So that's what I did there, right? And I was explaining how you need a condition, and you need initialize, and you need a change. So you need an I, T, and a C. So that's how the while loop works. Now this example that I'm explaining here is a different type compared to what we did. So in one case here, let's go back to this one. We used a for loop where we input the cost of 5 items and we found the sum. Right? How much did it cost us? So I want to do the same thing, but with a while loop where you're inputting an unknown number of items. When you go with a trolley full of goods and you go to the cashier and you need to pay for it, we don't know how many items are in the trolley. So we want to continue accumulating the cost of each item until there are no more items in the trolley. Okay, so that's where the while loop comes in. Now watch this. How do we set that up? The rule ITC still is applicable. Always remember, what am I testing? Now remember this question. Okay, this question said, let's first understand the question. The question wants us to input an unknown number of items purchased from a store, terminated with a 0, and then the question wants us to find the amount. Find the amount to pay. So this is now the full question, right? Input an unknown number of items purchased from a store, terminated with a 0. find the amount to pay. Okay, unlike the previous one where we had to input 5 items purchased from a store, find the amount to pay. That was a for loop. This is the same concept, but we don't know how many items. So let's understand this in detail. This is an important concept. So here's my while loop. I'm testing the cost. So repetition must take place while the cost is not equal to 0. So I need to repeat while the cost is not 0. Because remember, they're saying terminated when I stop the repetition when I enter 0. Stop the repetition when I enter 0 means repeat when it's not 0. So while it is not 0, keep repeating, keep looping. What am I doing? So that was my test. Before I can test my cost, you will notice that I input one value for the cost. I input a value for the cost. By inputting a value for the cost, I can now test to see if it's whether it's a 0 or not. So this is my initialize. This is my initialize. This is my test. That's my test. And notice here, I'm repeating my initialize. In other words, I'm getting another value for the cost, and that is my change. So my ITC is still in place. My ITC is still in place. And what am I doing here? Here is my accumulator that's adding up all the costs. So I get a cost. If it's not 0, I accumulate the cost. I get another cost. I go back up. If the new cost is not 0, I accumulate it and I get another cost. I go back up. If that cost is not equal to 0, I accumulate it and I get another cost. When I go back up, if that cost is equal to 0, remember my terminator was 0. If that cost is equal to 0, then I stop. The loop stops. And then I go out and I go to the next statement, which is going to display the total cost. So let's just give this, a run, right? And let's see how that works. So there's no errors. It says enter the cost. So that's coming from here, where it's saying enter the cost, and it's waiting for me to enter a value. So I'm going to enter a cost of 10. What's going to happen? Sum is set to 0. Is the cost not equal to 0? It's true. It's going to accumulate the cost, and it's going to wait for me to input another cost, right? So at this stage, it would have accumulated the cost here, and it's asking me for another cost. So I enter 20. It's going up. It's checking, is the cost not equal to 0? It's 20. Yes, true. It's not equal to 0. It accumulates the cost, and it's now asking me for another cost. I enter 30. It tests, it repeats, tests the condition, is 30 not equal to 0? Yes. It accumulates the cost, and it's asking me to enter another cost. And this can go on and on and on until I enter 0. Now when I enter 0 and I test my condition, the condition is going to fail. And this will bring the loop to an end. This brings the loop to an end, and then it's going to print the total cost. So now when I press enter, you will see it says the total cost is 60. 30 plus 20 plus 10, which is 60. So this loop could continue on and on and on, and it's going to accumulate, and it's going to stop when I enter 0. And that is what the question wanted me to do. Input an unknown number of items purchased, terminated with a 0. And how much did I pay? That will be the sum, which is accumulating each time, and it's finding how much I paid. So this is the while loop. We can't use a for loop to work out, to input an unknown number of numbers. We can't use a for loop because we need an endpoint. A for loop needs to know when to stop. Okay, so always remember, when you're setting up the while loop, remember ITC. That's your rule that you need to always follow, ITC. If you can keep that in place, then you should set up your loop correctly. Okay. The final looping structure, which is similar to a while loop, is the do while loop. Okay, we have something called a do while loop. So here is the do while loop. The do while loop is similar. It's similar to the while loop. It's also based on a condition. Right? It's also based on a condition, which is the while loop. And the way this works, I should say from the outset, this does not follow ITC. We're not going to use the ITC rule here. So the way this works is we say do, we open up a curly bracket, we close the curly bracket, and then we say while, and we have our condition, and then that's where it ends. Now here, the condition is at the end, and with the while loop, the condition is at the beginning. So we call this a pre-test. It starts first, like preschool, that's where we start pre. It's a start test, and this is at the end. So this is called a post-test. Okay, so when we're using a do while, we are testing at the end. But when we're using a while loop, we're testing at the beginning. So, which is the preferred loop to use? Because if you're using a while loop, you could convert that to a do while loop. Okay, so your while loop can definitely be converted into a do while loop. My suggestion would be, if you have a choice, rather use a while loop, the pre-test, instead of the do while loop. There are some instances where you want to test at the end. There are some programs that the test is better if it's at the end, in which case you will use a do while loop. But at this stage, at an introductory level, I would suggest that if you are unsure, use the while loop to execute your code. But understand how the do while structure, what the do while structure looks like. So if we jump into online GDB, I've got the do while setup here. That's the do while. Okay, it's inputting an unknown number of numbers. Okay. Some students may think, but this looks easier. I agree. I agree. This does look a bit easier. With the while loop, we had the I and the C was duplicated above and inside, and it seemed to be duplicated. This looks a lot simpler. Okay, but this, you can run into difficulties here, and you can get the incorrect output sometimes. So that is why I am saying, if you have a choice, stick to the while loop when you are coding instead of the do while. So here we're getting the cost of the item, and here we've got the accumulator, and the condition is still the same while cost is not equal to 0. Right? So this will continuously loop. It'll get new values each time, and it accumulates it. And outside the loop, it'll print the total. Now, if I give it a run, just for you to see how that works. So if I enter 10 as a cost, I then enter 20, I enter 30, and then I enter 0, you will notice that my total cost is 60. So that's correct, 30 plus 20 plus 10. One situation where the do while could run into a challenge is, what if you are terminating with a -1? Okay, let's say the question says input an unknown number of numbers terminated with a -1. I'm not terminating with a 0. Now, the shortcoming with the do while is that when you enter the -1, it's going to accumulate the -1, and then only it's going to exit the loop, which means the terminator was added to the cost, which was a -1. Let me give it a run so you can understand this better. So remember, when I entered 10, 20, and 30, my total should have been 60. But now when I enter -1 to terminate, you will notice that my total is 59 because it's adding the terminator. Previously, when I terminated with a 0, we didn't have that problem. But when my terminator is another value, then it does creates a problem. And this is the reason why I'm saying the while loop is a safer loop at introductory level, at a basic level of programming. If you are unsure, rather use the while loop. Make sure you have your I, your T, and your C, and it should work. You won't have those issues of your terminator being added. Even if I had to terminate here with a -1, if I terminate here with a -1, I won't have the same problem. Let me run it to show you. If I enter 10, 20, 30, and then I go -1, my total cost is still 60. And the reason for that is I've got a pretest. With the pretest, I first get the cost, I test before I accumulate. Even here as well, I get the cost, I test before I accumulate. So that helps. It's a safer loop from that perspective. So this lesson was about repetition in Java. We started off explaining the for loop, which was fixed repetition. We needed a starting point and end point, so we knew how many times the looping takes place. We then moved on to the while loop, which was conditional repetition. We did not know when it was going to end. It depends on the condition. And this followed a rule of ITC, initialize, test, and change. And then finally, we went on to the do while loop, which was similar to the while loop, except that this is a post condition. The condition is at the end, unlike the while loop, where it was a pre-condition, where your condition was at the beginning. I hope this lesson helped you to get a better understanding of how loops work in Java. There's still a lot more that can be said for each of these 3 different loops, but I think for now we will stop here, and you can practice these. Practice in particular how to use the while loop. That's important. Remember, when you're setting up the while loop, you don't want to go into an infinite loop, because if you don't set up your condition, your change, if you don't set up the change properly in the while loop, you can end up going into an infinite loop. Practice makes perfect, and you get better at it, and I'm sure if you work hard and continue to practice, you are going to do well. Hope this helps. Till the next time, take care and goodbye.